Let me introduce Richard Nugee, I'm just going to say former senior guy in the British Army in the Ministry of Defence, who wrote the MOD's first climate assessment. So we've got to hear a very interesting perspective from him. Penny Endersby, Professor Penny Endersby, is Chief Executive of the Met Office. So she lives and breathes this stuff professionally and personally, and we're gonna hear from her. Leah Berrang-Ford, also Professor, Deputy Director and Head of the Centre for Climate and Human Security at the UK Health Security Agency. So I think we're going to hear from Leah about heat and stress and all of that involves. And last but by no means least, Dr. Javonda Jacobs-Young, who we're delighted to say has come over from the States for this. She's Undersecretary for Research, Education and Economics at the US Department of Agriculture. Obviously, crops, crop yields, food security are huge themes for this session. I'm going to ask each of them just to give us, this is a little bit journalistic, but what's the sort of headline issue for them when they think of climate impacts on human security? What's the thing that's really right in the front of their minds, just briefly, and then we're going to drill into the topic in much more detail. Javonda, I'm looking at you down the end there, and I wonder whether you would just share with us what's, if you like, uppermost in your mind when it comes to a concern about climate impacts.
So thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Agriculture and forestry are on the front lines of the climate crisis, and we're uniquely positioned to be a part of the solution. We know that global food security and our future depends on our ability to meet the challenges of climate change, and I think most importantly, bottom line up front, food security is national security.
That's really powerful, and we're going to come back and explore that in more detail. Food security is national security. Let's just work along the line here. Leah, what's sort of burning in the front of your mind when you think of why this subject matters?
So thanks for the question. The things that keep me up at night, that in my role I really see as sort of a core responsibility, the burning sort of horizon risk would be a major heat wave or flood event in the UK, particularly thinking about the impact on particularly vulnerable populations, many of whom are very similar to the same populations who are vulnerable to COVID, including, for example, our over 65 population. And then the second thing I'll flag is the emergence of new vector-borne diseases. For example, dengue in London. We saw an outbreak of dengue in Paris, which is not just this past summer, which is not too far from London. So those are my highlights.
Okay, scary stuff, and we'll hear more about them. Penny, what for you? I mean, at the Met Office, you cover the great sweep of weather climate impacts, but what's uppermost?
So I guess, and good morning, and thank you for having me. I guess the Met Office has both a national and a global remit. So domestically, I'm with Leah, actually, the thing that keeps me most awake at night is the increase of all sorts of flooding, particularly surface water flooding, which is the most difficult for us to forecast in advance and warn. Globally, it would really be about involuntary migration, and we can see that human beings live within a particular climate niche, which is actually quite a small part of the globe, and over the next 50 years, somewhere between 1 and 3 billion of those human beings are going to be in parts of the globe that is no longer within our traditional climate niche. Either, and they're often vulnerable bits of the globe, there's some huge adaptation to do, or all those people are going to need to be somewhere else.
Okay, two monster issues there, Richard. And I know much of what we've heard so far plays into what you've been looking at.
Absolutely, and thank you, David. I think there are 5 areas of climate change where climate change really affects our national security.
I did ask for one.
I know.
What's the headline one?
So the headline one, I think, is that climate change leads to scarce resources. Scarce resources leads to the potential for tension, which leads to a cascade towards conflict, and allows, importantly, non-state actors, those who have a vested interest in getting rid of governments for their own power, to weaponize water, weaponize food, and therefore create instability in countries. And as Penny's already said, that may well lead to migration. And that, where are they going to go? They're going to go to somewhere that is better, that is more stable, that is more secure. And we're seeing that already around the world. And that, of course, affects us.
Well, look, thank you all very much for sort of sharing those. And I think it just gives, if you like, it sets the tone for this. And I know we all are sort of craving for optimism and positive solutions. And we'll try to get to those towards the end of this session, part 2 of this session. But I think we need to be absolutely upfront about what's at stake, what the problems are. And I wonder whether, Javonda, we could come back to you for your sort of assessment from where you sit of what the big issues are confronting you in terms of agriculture, crop yields, food security. What's from where you sit? What are the big questions there?
So the opportunity to set just a little bit of context around the challenges that we face. As Undersecretary at USDA and also the Chief Scientist for the Department of Agriculture, I have a significant role in leading 4 science agencies who are trying to help us meet the challenges we face around climate change. Quite frankly, we are looking at global agricultural productivity, environmental stewardship, and our ability to help our producers be profitable. We want to put that in there and continue to provide people with nutritious, abundant food. Yet we're doing all of this against the backdrop of climate change. And when we think about the extreme weather patterns and how they impact our producers, we think about flooding and drought. We think about extreme temperatures, either high or low, but they're not typical temperatures for that region. And how do we continue to innovate to be able to meet those challenges? We know that agriculture research in the US, every $1 in investment for public ag research results in $20 of economic opportunity, not just for producers, but for the economy in general. And right now, we're expected to see our global population exceed 9 billion people by 2050. We're at 8 billion right now, and so all of those people will need to eat. They'll need fiber for their clothing, they'll need fuel for their vehicles, and how do we meet those challenges? Because today, we still have many people around the world who don't have enough to eat. And once again, food security and our success in meeting food and nutrition security is critical for national security.
That's so interesting, and I remember filming in Oklahoma during a prolonged drought, and the theme we were pursuing was it a reenactment of the 1930s Dust Bowl scenario? And what struck me is actually how vulnerable and how fragile it is. I mean, the band of ideal weather for really good yields is quite narrow, isn't it? I mean, it's quite striking how not much change creates quite a knock-on effect. Yeah. I know, Penny, this is a big theme that you've been looking at.
Yeah, so I was just thinking that, I mean, obviously this year we've had an exceptionally wet 18 months and a very,
is it the wettest?
I think it's the wettest 18 months.
Wettest 18 months, okay,
record.
yeah.
And we are seeing already farmers telling us that our wheat yields are going to be lower this year. So on the one hand, we're
there's
talking
an immediate
about
impact. Yeah.
the impact of the drought, and at the same time we see impacts of flooding. And we do get engaged in the Met Office in looking at the potential for multi-bread basket collapse, where you might see maize or wheat crops fail in 3 or more areas of main cereal growth around the world, and they undoubtedly will increase over time as climate stresses increase.
Picking up on that, the scenario of several globally important grain baskets failing at the same time, what does the science tell us about that?
So the latest data I have suggests that the chance of a multi-bread basket collapse, and that was defined in this particular paper as 3 areas of the globe at once, is about 6% in a decade.
Translating that into plain English, what does that mean? That it's not that likely, that it's...
So at the moment, it's not that likely. Even characterising how often it happens has taken quite a lot of science to do. And I'm going to sneak in one piece of good news, which is that although the events that you would expect to drive it have increased already, actually the number of breadbasket collapses so far has not increased. If you look in the first half of the 20th century versus the second, the better forecasting, fewer cold events, better agriculture has so far adapted to it. Whether that can continue is a whole different question.
We're definitely going to come back to the adaptations and how to make agriculture more resilient. I'm wondering whether, Richard, from a security perspective, the prospect of several, one or more, big food-producing regions getting hit by some sort of climate impact, or indeed a climate impact in one and some other political thing in another. I'm thinking of Ukraine.
Well, that was the point I was going to make, which is that, of course, it's not just climate change which is making agriculture more difficult at the moment. The Ukrainian breadbasket is nothing like as substantial as it was because of the war there. And so I think it's, but the effect of that, in the UK it will be increased prices and potentially that we won't be able to get the things that we are used to. And I remember, what was it, a year and a bit ago now, we ran out of tomatoes, and that was for a short while. And that was not because there weren't enough tomatoes or in the world, or the fact that we couldn't afford tomatoes. It was the fact that our suppliers in Spain didn't want to sell to us because they wanted to sell to their own communities.
You haven't mentioned the word Brexit, but it's hovering there.
Yeah, but there's a reality that actually, if people are short of food, they will feed their own communities first. I think, rather than export it. And we are very heavily dependent on exports or import of food in this country. But I think it's more the fact that's how it affects us. But there are parts of the world where actually a lack of food is going to lead to tensions, which is going to lead to areas not able to be inhabitable.
Yeah.
And those tensions themselves are going to lead to migration, which will lead to more tension later.
And if you do get impacts on crop yields for whatever reason, prices go up. And Leah, you talked about the impacts on vulnerable populations. Many of the communities that suffered most in COVID may be the ones who suffer most from climate impacts. And I would suggest that actually rising food prices is a big element of that. Does that cross your desk at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great segue into health. So there's significant and growing evidence that climate change will affect UK food security and impact, UK health security, and impact health nationally through really a wide range of pathways, one of which is food and nutrition. So many of the foods that we import are from highly climate-sensitive countries, and we've done some modeling in our most recent release of a health effects of climate change report that tells us that could have impacts on nutrition in the UK. So
Sorry, can I just ask you to expand on that? So is it literally the inability to afford nutritious food? Or what's the sequence that leads to that problem?
Yeah, often this is disruption of food supply chains.
Right.
That'll affect our access to some more nutritious foods. So some of those that may be the most vulnerable would be sort of fruits and vegetables, for example. And in my local store, I also saw those empty tomato areas that had a sign that said adverse weather has caused basically this empty shelf for tomatoes.
So a climate-aware storekeeper. That's progress of a sort.
But I think that's just one example of the types of health impacts that climate will have. Some, I think, are those that people find more intuitive, things like heat waves. So there will be many in this audience who say, I like the idea of a bit more sun, especially after this past winter and spring. For others, a heat wave is uncomfortable and a nuisance. But for vulnerable people with pre-existing conditions, particularly in the older ages, heat waves can significantly advance your risk of death. So we see, on average, somewhere around 1,500 excess deaths that we can attribute to heat each year, sort of on average historically. During the year where we had a major heat wave, that increased and we saw something closer to 3,000. Our projections tell us that for a sort of worst case high warming scenario with no real concerted adaptation, that number could rise to over 20,000 deaths, excess deaths attributable to heat.
And that's in the UK, to be clear.
This is
Yes.
for the UK.
Yeah. So that's a big jump up. Now, while Leo, you were explaining all that, Penny, you were nodding vigorously. So let's get into heat, shall we then? Is that what you want to jump in on?
So I was reflecting on actually the conversation we had in the queue about cascading risks, and particularly thinking about the extreme heat in July 2022 in the UK. We undoubtedly did see a spike in excess heat-related deaths. We were discussing the wildfires and particularly the impacts of multiple fires, London Fire Brigade having its busiest day. We also lost data centres, one of which was serving Guy's Hospital. Wildfires make smoke, which also affects air quality and affects those same vulnerable groups who are also vulnerable to heat. And that's just one day in one not particularly climate vulnerable country. But that relates to what you were saying about the breadbaskets compounded by the security situations, compounded by bad actors. And none of these climate risks stand on their own. It's always the complexity and how they're interrelated.
So it's sort of one thing compounding another. And I think it was the Climate Change Committee who said that England might have a 40-degree plus temperature in the 2030s, but that when we got that in 2022, it was like a decade too early or something. Is that, have I understood that right? Are things happening a bit faster than we expect?
So I'm not sure what the Climate Change Committee said. We in the Met Office, it was the first time we were able in real time to attribute an event to climate change and say, we have run 1,000 summers without the additional carbon, we've run 1,000 summers models with the additional carbon. You do not see 40 degrees in an unperturbed climate, so this can only have happened with climate change. We saw it then as a rare but possible event for 2022. So there weren't many 40-degree summers, and obviously then going on, we think it'll be routine in 2050.
Now, Richard, I think it was the US Army that did a lot of work on the so-called wet bulb globe temperature, the combination of heat and humidity affecting the ability of soldiers to operate without collapsing, because I think above a certain temperature, the perspiration can't evaporate, above a certain combination of heat and humidity. I mean, so heat, presumably, and humidity have been sort of a big deal in military thinking.
Yes, and I think we have, in the military, we've learnt an awful lot from fighting in hot places reasonably recently, and have been able to adapt a bit. But it's absolutely right. And what's in a sense, when you're in operations, you do what you have to do. But when you're training, we have very strict guidelines on what heat you can train people in, because what you really don't want to do is damage people through heat whilst you're training. So it was actually the Met Office who predicted that, for example, our training areas in Cyprus, come 2040, in the month of August, will not be able to be trained in.
But the human body sort of can't cope.
Correct, because we will be constantly over the wet bulb globe thermometer excesses. But it's not only heat and humidity. What you saw last year was that in New York State, for example, the American Army could not train because of the smoke coming from the wildfires from Canada,
right,
which is the result of climate change, which stopped them from training.
And
Yeah.
I have a tiny job as chair of the steering group of Dartmoor National Park, where they do live fire training, and they have days where there's fire days and they can't do live fire training. And we're looking at the projection for that and saying there's going to be huge swathes of the year where you can't do your live fire training on a pretty soggy part of the UK.
Yeah, okay, fascinating. Well, look, I think if we had enough bad stuff, I'm just wondering, looking out, there's a bit of nodding there. Let's pivot. Let's do our welcome pivot, if we can. Javondra, I wonder whether you would help us with kick that off, this sort of second half of the session. What kind of work you and your teams are doing? You've touched on, I think, adapting to making farmers more resilient so that agriculture isn't hit quite so badly with flooding and drought and heat. Talk us through, if you would, the sorts of programs you've got.
Yeah, absolutely. I do believe that with great challenge comes great opportunity. And that's where, agricultural science and our researchers come into play. That's what we do. We innovate and we help our producers and consumers meet the challenges they face. So we believe that in order to meet the challenges globally, that we're going to need collective action. And more importantly, we need to grow our global ambition because there is a sense of urgency. The United States, in partnership with the United Arab Emirates, initiated the Aim for Climate mission, and we have been able to, I would say, coalesce around a common goal globally. UAE and the United States have brought together many organizations, public, private, philanthropic, and I'm just happy to share that some of the accomplishments of what we've achieved with Aim for Climate. The US and UAE have mobilized $17 billion in climate-smart agriculture and food systems innovation. We've launched over 75 innovation sprints and formed a historic climate-smart agriculture coalition with over 600 partners globally. Internal to the United States, we have passed historic legislation. Under President Biden's leadership, we've been able to invest billions of dollars in climate-smart agriculture, really helping to meet the challenges we face around reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, encouraging new economic activity in rural areas, those marginalized communities we've talked a little bit about. How do we use this opportunity to be responsive to our climate challenges and produce economic opportunities for rural communities, marginalized communities? We're working in that space. And we also want to be able to protect those communities. And so how do we do that? I've heard a little bit from our other speakers about food systems transformation. These investments provide us an opportunity. We also were able to identify some vulnerabilities that we face in our food systems in the United States during the COVID pandemic. And this is our opportunity to transform how we think about, how we supply our citizens with nutritious, abundant, diverse, reasonably affordable food. And that requires all of us to work together. We've also invested $3.1 billion in that next stage. In some areas, they call it the valley of death, when you have an innovation and somehow it can't make it out. And our science is nothing if it stays in our laboratories and our dusty file cabinets in a peer-reviewed publication. Sorry, professor. But they have to be pushed out. And that requires us to translate that into action. And so we've invested $3.1 billion in climate-smart commodities. So putting that money out into the system to help us implement a lot of those research innovations that we've identified. How do we put them in practice? Things like cover crops, no-till, looking at biofuels, really churning innovations for the bioeconomy in general. So really putting investments behind what we think are important topics for us to take on during this important time in our history.
No, thanks very much for explaining all that. And I think that the sort of news coverage, the headlines about the Inflation Reduction Act have tended to focus on energy. And so I think it's great that you've laid out what it's also doing for particularly climate-smart agriculture?
Well, I'll share with you, David, that I've been in USDA for over 2 decades. This is the largest level of investment historic in this space. I'll also share with you that we've also looked at the next generation of professionals for this space, and making sure that those young people are trained and able to work across disciplines, up and down, up and across. And so how do we make sure that we're prepared for the future? In US, our average farmer the average age is 58.1 years old.
Sorry, 58.1.
58.1.
Okay.
I know that because I'm also over the National Agricultural Statistics Service, and we do something called the Census of Agriculture. But we recognize that a large portion of our farmers are also over the age of 65. In the agencies that I lead, 4 agencies, about 8,500 people, 1,500 of those people are eligible to retire today. So if we don't train the next generation, I'm not sure what the scenario is here in the UK, we're in trouble. So the administration has invested $262.5 million in training 20,000 students to be prepared to hopefully take my place one day.
To bring in a new generation.
A new crop of professionals.
That's great. Leah, when you think about what can be done, how to combat, deal with, adapt to some of the problems you've outlined, I guess is a big part of it just raising awareness, make people look out for new diseases, be aware of the risks of flooding where they live? What sort of... I'm grasping at straws here for positives.
Yeah, no, it's much more than that. I think there is a lot of optimism. Importantly, the health impacts of climate change in this country are not inevitable. The organization that I work for, the UK Health Security Agency, established a Center for Climate and Health Security, which I lead, specifically to answer these questions and to move us from risks and problems to solutions. So moving from, I like to say, the paralysis of climate change to really pragmatism and professionalism. So there is exceptional evidence that some interventions provide a really high ratio of benefit to cost. For example, somewhere there's the strongest evidence are early warning systems, alerting systems, and so for that reason we released a weather health alerting system in partnership with the Met Office just last year. We now have a new adverse weather and health plan to cascade action and information to the public health system when temperatures start to rise. So there are some temperatures that might not be sort of a heat issue for the general public, but do hit a threshold at which action is needed, for example, in social care homes. Serendipitously, there are many interventions that are good for our health anyway, and will also protect us from the impacts of climate change and build resilience, and are good for emissions reductions. There are a lot of these win-wins. The sort of biggest categories that the evidence tells us we can get these win-wins tend to be in behavioral shifts, typically in terms of food and travel behaviors. So many of the foods that are lower carbon, not all, but many foods that are lower carbon are also good for our health. Okay? So that there are many no regrets opportunities. The second category is many greening, or often called nature-based initiatives, that can result in some cases in emissions reductions, often have really diverse benefits for health through, for example, shade, mental health, thermal comfort, so heating. However, there are some trade-offs, and one of the ones that I wanted to flag is if we are moving forward with greening initiatives, so whatever you want to call it, rewilding, greening, nature-based solutions, we have to be careful, because in some cases, if those aren't done carefully and intentionally, we can be creating new habitats for vector-borne diseases. And so what we really look at is how can we transform, make policy decisions while balancing these trade-offs, maximizing the benefits, those real no regrets win-win options, which are there for us, while minimizing the trade-offs, such as...
Can you give us an example of that? I mean, I'm thinking of creating a pond, which might have a nice effect, cooling effect, but it's terrific for mosquitoes. I don't know, what?
Yeah, so mosquitoes are a good example. We've been working with some local authorities who want to roll out ambitious green plans, for example. And they're telling us, well, we want to make sure that we're getting health benefits and avoiding trade-offs. And so it's not necessary that simply having green space will always introduce mosquito and tick habitat. If those are developed appropriately, with, for example, it depends on whether there's wildlife habitat and whether that wildlife habitat creates space for the animals that can eat the mosquitoes. It depends on how much standing water you might create. So particularly on the south coast of the UK, we want to make sure that our greening initiatives are looked at alongside the risks. And I'm thinking particularly of this mosquito species, Aedes albopictus, which is marching its way up through Europe. It's on the way to us. This is the mosquito that can
Is that the tiger mosquito?
Yes,
yeah,
the tiger
okay.
mosquito. You might have seen in the scaremongering in the news, that can carry transmit things like dengue, chikungunya, and part of our job in my center is to do the monitoring and surveillance. So we know when the first mosquitoes arrive, we can delay that introduction as long as possible. And that's where we're working with local authorities to really ensure that our greening is done smart.
I love the way. Did you all notice that Leah didn't use that dreadful word co-benefits, but she spelled out some co-benefits very cogently, so thank you. Penny, obviously a lot of this, in terms of adapting, getting ready, minimizing impacts, does come down to good forecasting, which, as we all know, is getting better and better, but nevertheless there are some limits, aren't there? Now what can you, particularly with surface water flooding, vicious storms dropping huge amounts of water in places where you can't quite predict. But nevertheless, you are obviously getting more and more sophisticated in what you can do.
Yeah. So, Leah picked up two fantastic big themes there, and one was the co-benefits, and the other was the early warning. And in the UK, we're pretty fortunate. We have really good predictive capabilities and a really good onward system, because it's not enough for the Met Office to forecast it well and tell people it's coming. The whole of the UK system then has to respond, and the population needs to know what to do. And I'm just going to come back to your good news for a minute. And on the, it was only after the July heatwave, well after, that somebody said to me, we didn't lose anybody in an organised sporting event. There were no deaths in organised events. And I can only assume that's because people who were running them looked at the red warning and thought, I don't fancy our insurance. That's good. But surface water flooding, you're right, is the most challenging thing. It's the one that keeps me awake at night, because that's the one where someone will come back to me and say, why didn't you tell us? And these are very small scale events that you get from like a thunderstorm. A big storm like Storm Eunice, we might give 8 days warning of the Met Office. Even on our least fortunate scenarios, we would give 1 or 2. For surface water flooding, we're talking about 1 or 2 hours we're doing well. And obviously then that puts lots of pressure on the onward system. There's lots of research going on with us and the Environment Agency to improve our capabilities. But again, it is the whole system. Just globally, there's some fantastic initiatives going on, headed up by the WMO, to which I'm the UK's delegate, the World Meteorological Organization, trying to see that everybody in the planet has access to early warning for severe weather events, because there's lots of people who have literally nothing. The first thing they know is seaweed and when the weather changes. And so getting that basic prediction and warning system in place for less fortunate populations, there is good news there. It is coming.
We saw the effects of that, didn't we? Very often now if a typhoon hits the Philippines, it's extraordinary how the early warning genuinely saved lots of lives compared to 10, 15 years ago.
Bangladesh are amazing.
Bangladesh, amazing community warning systems derived from the forecasting. But then we saw the flip side of when that doesn't work. In Libya, a year or so ago, was it 10,000 died in flooding? I mean, there was no functioning government of a kind that could provide warning. So all of those people were just left...
Bad infrastructure, catastrophic climate-driven rainfall that was completely unprecedented, and no functional warning system. And then when after the event, a lot of their water supply was by desalination, and so they then had no having been wiped out by water, they then had no water as well because the desalination plants went down. Just an appalling worst-case scenario for...
So we're working hard at trying to be positive. It's a bit of an uphill struggle. Richard, looking perhaps less from the military perspective, more just security in a broader sense. We're in our last few minutes here now. What would you like to highlight as positives? I would argue that raised awareness is a starting point.
I think that's right. I think that understanding what the problems are is something that is going to have a huge effect on people's security. If they're aware of the potential for tension to be raised because of scarce resources, aware of what people are doing to try and use that for their own benefit, then I think that's a start. But there's more to it than that. There's got to be some form of global understanding that actually climate change does affect people's security. And it's very difficult in this country, I think, to really acknowledge that and understand that because our security doesn't feel threatened at all. But for many parts of the world, their security is very definitely threatened by the effects of climate change on food, water, and so on, as we've been discussing. And I think, therefore, understanding how we can start to negotiate, not only in terms of adaptation and help with adaptation. It's one of the things I think Britain is one of the world-leading innovative countries. We produce more patents than almost every other country per capita in the world. And we should be exporting that expertise. We should be exporting the brilliance of our innovators into parts of the world where it'll have a significant impact. And that actually is the case for the military as well. And I would urge all innovators in the room to think about whether their innovation could be used for the military. Not all innovation in the military is to do with weapons. A lot of it's to do with how we interact with the local communities of the countries we're in. And if we can use some of that innovation to improve their lives and reduce tension, then actually there's an opportunity there for increasing the amount of peace that we might create, reducing tension, and therefore reducing the opportunity for conflict.
I think one of the problems with this is siloed thinking. We've got sort of agriculture, we've got health, we've got forecasting, we've got security broadly. And I think a lot of this, the sort of motivation to adapt to a more hostile climate comes up against that. And so it's terrific that there are now more and more connections being created. But it's human nature, isn't it? It takes a while to sort of overcome compartmentalization and to sort of break down that kind of thinking. Look, I think we've actually run out of time. So it's a great pity we never had Rosie Boycott here. She would have added to the debate about food, so she must have been delayed somewhere. But I think we've covered a lot of very useful ground. For those who were yearning for good news, I hope we delivered some, at least strands of positive thinking to end on. Would you all join me in thanking a really stellar panel? Thank you very much.